Hello everyone, and welcome to the Adaptable, Visitable, and Universal Housing webinar here at the Livable Canada Conference on April 2021. Who am I? My name is Thea. I'm the Vice President at Designable Environments. You can learn more about our company by visiting our website at designable.ca, or you can find me on social media at Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, or Instagram. My Twitter handle is @tcurdy, but on LinkedIn I post more detailed answers. Who is Designable Environments? We are Canada's leading accessibility and universal design consultants. We've been practicing in this area of specialty for the built environment for the last 33 years. Our staff all have architectural backgrounds. Our services include 4 main areas: drawing reviews, where we work with design teams to create new builds and renovations to try to meet the accessibility requirements and universal applications that the stakeholders need. The second service we provide is building audits, where we go and examine a building, photograph it, measure it, and find and record all of the barriers in the building, and then make recommendations about what could be fixed and how to fix it. Our third service is creating accessibility standards for every level of government across Canada and internationally, as well as for large organizations, government, and institutions. That, of course, leads to our fourth service, which is my favorite: research and education. Accessibility is the only thing we do, no distractions. So again, you can learn more about us at designable.ca. Our agenda today covers 7 different things. The first is the Canadian accessibility and housing legislation. 2, our international agreements. 3, an examination of what is disability. 4, what is adaptable, visitable, and universal housing. 5, what are other places doing. 6, examples of housing modifications and universal housing. And 7, of course, success stories. So let's get started with agenda item number 1, Canadian accessibility and housing legislation. So first, we need to understand our laws. As you may have heard, we now have the Accessible Canada Act, also known as the ACA. The vision of this legislation is to proactively eliminate and prevent barriers and ensure greater opportunities for persons with disabilities. The Accessible Canada Act has a goal of making Canada accessible by 2040. The goals of the Accessible Canada Act include 5 things. 1, the realization of a barrier-free Canada. 2, culture change. 3, standards developments. So the Act itself doesn't tell you how to do it, the standards will. 4, proactive compliance and enforcement measures. And 5, monitoring and oversight. But where does the Accessible Canada Act apply? Well, as this is federal legislation, it applies to things like the Parliament, anything related to the Government of Canada, and of course anything federally regulated in the private sector, which could include things like the RCMP and post offices. At the bottom of the graphic here we have on the screen, it says nothing about us without us. One of the most important aspects of the Accessible Canada Act is it will be implemented in partnership with persons with disabilities and the disability community. In Canada, most people are not aware that we actually changed 2 really important laws almost 40 years ago. The first being the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was changed to recognize people with disabilities as equal citizens under our laws. And the second then being the Human Rights Code amendments, which said that buildings and spaces shall not discriminate against people. That means that we actually have a hierarchy in our laws. The Human Rights Code is the higher law. So if it says we shall not create discrimination in our buildings and spaces, the building code, which could be the National Building Code or your local provincial building code, the Accessible Canada Act or your local provincial accessibility acts, though the building codes and the accessibility acts are actually below in the hierarchy of things from the Human Rights Code. So human rights tribunals have warned us that by simply following the minimum requirements from the National Building Code and from the Accessible Canada Act, for example, you may not be meeting the Human Rights Code requirements. You may have also heard that Canada has a priority about housing, and the National Housing Strategy includes funding models from the Canadian Housing and Mortgage Corporation, which is encouraging a level of accessibility in all rental and apartment housing that's being developed. But notice that's not regular individual housing or housing developments. You may also be aware that 4 of our provinces are now including additional accessibility legislation to fill in the gaps and try to better reach our human rights objectives. In Ontario, we have the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 2005. In Manitoba, the Accessibility for Manitobans Act, passed in 2013. And in Nova Scotia, the Nova Scotia Accessibility Act in 2017. Note that none of these 3 have any accessibility requirements for housing yet. Let's hope it comes soon. British Columbia does have legislation that they are planning to pass, but it has not yet come out. And as I mentioned, the 4th one was from Quebec, but the Quebec one is more about employment and rights for access to employment and education and healthcare. So again, nothing to do with housing. In the Ontario Building Code, we see some important changes to housing. Although it specifically exempts most type of housing, it does have requirements for apartments, which could include apartments and condominiums as a part of the legal definition. So apartment buildings are required to have at least 15% of the suites to provide a barrier-free path of travel on the same level from the entrance to at least 1 bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a living space. Now notice that doesn't say it has to be accessible, but just that you have to have a barrier-free path of travel to each of those elements. The bathrooms do have a little bit more requirements for accessible sinks, blocking around the toilets for grab bars, and a turning space of at least 1,500 millimeters in diameter. This is good, but it doesn't include all of the things we're going to be talking about in our session today. The AODA, as we mentioned, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, for example, was to make Ontario accessible by 2025. The integrated accessibility standards include the customer service standard, information and communication standard, employment, transportation, and the design of public spaces. Notice none of those are about housing. So there is some talk about adding a housing standard, but it hasn't materialized yet. BC has a BC housing standard, which does include, again, some accessibility requirements for housing, but it's been mostly focused on accessibility for apartments and, again, maybe for condos. And Stephanie Cadeau, the MLA out in Vancouver, has been pushing to change the legislation at the BC Building Code level to include accessibility in all housing. But unfortunately, because there is a gap between what our Human Rights Code says and what our legislation tells us the minimum we need to do, this is a liability risk. If you followed it for housing, it doesn't mean you're protected from a case in front of the Human Rights Tribunal. So here we see a case that happened in November, I believe, last year, 2020, where a condominium was taken to the Human Rights Tribunal and found to be not meeting the human rights requirements. And they had to pay not only fix the barriers, but also pay for the injury to the dignity, feelings, and respect of the complainant. So who supports having accessible housing, age-in-place housing, visitable, adaptable, all these words you hear? Well, the Canadian, the CARP has a vision for both accessible or age-friendly cities and communities. So thinking about age in place and our aging populations. We also see the Canadian Housing Network supporting co-housing, and that co-housing should be age in place friendly to allow people some greater dignity and not to be so lonely as living in place in your own home might be, particularly if you're a widower. So item number 2, let's have a quick look at our international agreements. A lot of people are very excited about the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. And what they don't realize is that the SDGs are really laced with or full of disability accommodations. So if you want to learn more, there's a website that can help you understand that better, or that you can direct people to. Here's the information on the Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It's a UN international agreement that Canada signed. And again, this talks about accessibility for communities, and housing is an integral part of making sure you have equal rights for everyone. Unfortunately, Canada has not changed our building codes, as we mentioned, to include housing as a part of accessibility. It exempts almost every type of housing, except, as you saw, a little bit in Ontario and in some other places. So cases have been brought before the UN to complain about this, and this complaint is likely the reason that they're trying desperately to fix and our building codes and have the conversation about what accessible housing actually is. Again, back to our agenda. Third item, let's have a quick conversation about what exactly is a disability. What are we trying to accommodate for? Well, did you know that in 2017, the Canadian Survey on Disability was done and found that for people 15 and older, 22% of Canadians reported having at least one type of disability, which amounted in 2017 to about 6.2 million people. Now, today is April 2021, so this number is out of date, and because our society is rapidly aging to the tune of over 1,000 Canadians a day turning 65, where the disability rate is almost twice that of the Canadian average, we can see that the number is likely going north and has changed already to be a larger number. So understanding these statistics, when you start talking about percentages, it can be hard to understand what that means. So if we just thought about that from the Ontario perspective, where we had a population in 2018 of 14.32 million people, at 22%, that would mean 3.15 million people reported having a disability. That would mean 3.1 million people who need to be finding housing that accommodates their accessibility needs. In Ottawa, for example, where they have almost a million people or had almost a million people in 2017, at 1%, that would mean almost 10,000 people had disabilities that needed accommodations. At 10%, that would be almost 100,000. But at 22%, it's over 200,000 people with disabilities who need accommodations. Their families need to have accommodations. Their workplaces need accommodations. There's a lot of people impacted. And in 2017, we had a very historic moment where, like most first world countries, the number of Ontarians over the age of 65 was a larger share of the population than those under the age of 14. So this is a historic shift in our demographics. But what exactly is a disability? Well, the international symbol of disability is a static person in a wheelchair with a head on it. We see the dynamic symbol to the right of this, which is championed by the forward movement, to try to better demonstrate that people with disabilities are capable and active participants in their societies. But the problem with both of these symbols is they're looking at wheelchairs. So people naturally look at it and try to problem solve and design for wheelchairs. But that doesn't account for people who have vision loss, which is a far greater number, the people with hearing loss, the people who are deaf or deafened, autistic, amputees, have multiple chemical sensitivities, are neurodevelopmental, have guide or service animals, or use scooters, which take larger spaces to turn and occupy. So we're really not thinking about the full range of different types of disabilities as we're trying to problem solve and create better design that works for everybody. Back to our agenda. Item number 4. Let's get to the meat of this. What is the adaptable, visitable, and universal housing anyway? So let's get into some definitions here. The first one, let's talk about visitable housing. So here we see on the right a picture of a lovely home. Visitable housing does 3 important things, at least 3 important things. Allows people with mobility devices to visit. It supports the Canadian Charter of Rights and our Human Rights Code, recognizing everybody as equals and not creating spaces that discriminate. And then, of course, by having houses that are that people can visit each other in, borrow a cup of sugar, help with babysitting, come over for a barbecue, come over for dinner or a celebration. This supports community health as well as mental health. If people can't visit other people's houses, then they might be trapped in their homes, which obviously would have a cost. The features that you would be looking at a visitable home include an entrance with no step, doors that are wider and have a lever hardware or lever doorknobs. You'd want a main floor washroom with a wider door, a toilet that was accessible with a transfer space, a sink, and a roll-in shower so that people who are staying a little bit longer can take care of themselves. And of course, access to the backyard deck or your balcony. If you're looking for more information about visitable housing than we have time to cover today, the Visitable Housing Canada website still exists. The group is no longer working, but they have archived the site for people to use. So some of the information might be a little bit out of date, but there's a lot of great stuff here. So you definitely should check that out. So let's move now to our second type of housing, adaptable housing. And adaptable housing must be modifiable. This means that the accessible modifications can be easy to be made. So as you're designing and planning and building, you're thinking ahead. If I was to try to change this, how could I make it less expensive to do so? So number 2, the modifications are less expensive to make. And number 3, it supports age in place, or something that a lot of people in the older community prefer to call living in place. You move into a house in a community in a place that you love to live, and you want to continue living there until you choose to leave. So here's some adaptable housing features. You see some pictures here on the right as well. The hallways and staircases tend to be a little bit wider and tend to be straight. The thresholds tend to be very minimum, less than 6 millimeters in height, and again, the doors are wider. This is also great for getting furniture in and out. For the floor plan is clear and free of obstructions. The kitchens and washrooms and bathrooms have enough clear space for mobility devices should they be needed or when they are needed. And you put blocking or supports in the wall so that if later on you need to put in in the ceiling, so if later on you need to put in a ceiling lift, or if you need to put in a chair lift, or if you need to put in grab bars or handrails in your corridors, you don't have to tear open the walls to get that done. So much less expensive. And of course, by providing stacked closets for all of the storage you need throughout your life, those can be easily transitioned into an elevator shaft later on. So really good planning. Expensive mistakes that we see have become popular, particularly, and here we have some examples of some stairs. So the picture on the left is a curved set of wooden stairs. The problem with curved stairs is the one side that's closest to the curve has a shorter step than the side away from it. So it's easier to trip and fall on these stairs. These stairs, you see there's no color contrast between each stair, so for someone with vision loss, this can be hard to be looking at. It does have handrails on both sides, but again, the color contrast is very minimum for people with vision loss. The picture in the middle looks sort of like a waterfall. So it's a very pretty thing to look at, but imagine if somebody put in a staircase that had a handrail on one side and looked like normal stairs on one side, but the other side had stair treads that were much shorter and grouped closer together, like water was coming down. Try to imagine a 3-year-old or a drunk person who's trying to come down these stairs. This would be very dangerous. But the most dangerous of these is the picture on the right, which I call the ribbon stairs. Because each stair is placed not aligned with them. You have to get the right foot on the right tread and the left foot on the left tread, otherwise you'd fall down. The handrail is on one side, but it doesn't go all the way to the bottom. There's no handrail or protection on the other side. And worst of all, these are open riser steps, which means it's very easy for people to catch their toe as they're climbing the stairs. And unfortunately, because falling up the stairs happens so quickly, people are more often to hurt themselves quite badly falling up the stairs. So finally, if we talked about number 3, our universal design housing, this creates housing that works for everyone. So when you think about a typical house, we're thinking about averages for people, but we're not accounting for the differences between taller and shorter people, left and right-handed people, those who are losing their hearing and or vision, dexterity, or stamina. We're not thinking about the differences between children's needs, adults' needs, and seniors' needs. And of course, none of our design trends are accounting for the important things like color contrast and lever hardware. So again, the CMHC has a great website with lots of good information about universal design housing I encourage you to look at. So inclusive housing must-haves isn't just about the housing. It's about the house and where it's located. So if you were going to be very independent, preserving your dignity and your respect, you would want to have access to transit, community services, shopping, education, and employment from your house. It's about quality, choice, and affordability. So in an apartment building or condo, don't put them all on the first floor. You want them distributed with at different levels and different views with different features, giving people choice. The accessible parking for residents and guests is an important feature. If you're buying a townhouse, we often see that's missing. And then, of course, age and place opportunities, as we mentioned before. So here's the website for the Canadian Morganton Housing Corporation about accessible and adaptive housing, and you can see that there's categories for all kinds of information, great drawings, great research. I encourage you to check this out. So number 5 on our agenda, what are other places doing? So let's get some inspiration here. Well, we see the Australian Network for Universal Design Housing has put out a campaign to change their legislation with some ads called 5 Reasons in 20 Seconds Why We All Need Accessible Housing. So you should definitely check that out. And they also recently published the AHURI brief, which demonstrates that providing accessible and adaptable housing can save our society a lot of money. So for example, someone on a home support program can cost the government around $3,900 per year in Australia. But the cost of a person living in a residential care costs around $69,000 a year. That's a lot of money. The benefits of accessible housing design, 1, keeps people at home more safely. 2, reduces care hours where people can be independent and take care of themselves. So care hours are reduced because you can be more independent and take care of yourself without the assistance. Rental accommodations that are not built using accessible or adaptable design principles mean that when modifications are necessary, they could be denied by the landlord, requiring people to move. And if there aren't other options, what are your choices? You might have to move further away, and unfortunately, some people can become homeless. And then, of course, without accessible design, the early entry into an institution may be an inevitable outcome. So really good reasons to be thinking about this. We also see in Australia a really great website from Alzheimer's WA called Dementia Enabling Environments, and they have this really excellent website that talks you through every single room and accommodations that help with dementia. In New Zealand, they have a really great program called Lifemark that encourages developers to create more accessibility through a benefit program. So the more accessible the building type they pick or a house they picked, the more benefits they get. In the UK, we have Habinteg, which has been working on accessible houses and independent lives for a long time, and they are often advocating to government about improving accessible legislation, and they have pointed out that the UK benefits for accessible housing include a reduction in falls, mental health, and other care costs, avoidable hospital administration, increased stays in hospital due to a lack of accessible housing to return to, and that just one night in hospital in the National National Health Service, the NHS, costs about $273, while a week's care costs $550. So definitely some benefits there to think about. In the United States, they've had the Fair Housing Act as a part of since 1968, which was a part of the Civil Rights Act. It prohibits discrimination in the financing, leasing, buying, or renting of housing. The discrimination can't be based on anything, typically that you would think of, but also with disability as well. Now, unfortunately, this is mostly applied to apartment housing again, rather than individual housing, but it is something that's been there and some great regulations there as well. The Better Living Design Group, or BLD, has been working for a long time to increase universal design awareness. And here their website was talking about how by adding accessible, adaptable features to a home, it can only cost anywhere from 0 to 5% more than traditional housing. But if you thought about how much it would cost to fix a house later on, that would well exceed that. And of course, the more experienced your contractor or designer are, the less these expenses cost. So back to our agenda, let's see some examples of housing modifications and universal housing. So here we see from the Daniels Corporation, they have an accessible design program. Here's one of their 1-bedroom layouts. And on the left, we see the visitable washroom for the unit. We can see that there's space here. We have a sink, we have a toilet, and we have a roll-in shower with a fold-down shower seat. Here we see that there's enough space to turn around, as it was said in the building code, but it also includes the transfer space beside the toilet. This makes it usable for people with mobility devices to be able to transfer to the toilet. Now, the grab bars aren't shown in this particular drawing, but the blocking is in the wall as per code, so they could be added later on as needed. Of course, with kitchens, we see that there's a lot of modifications happening with kitchens that are exciting. We're starting to see, like the kitchen on the left, the idea of adjustable height counters, both for the upper cabinets and the lower cabinets. And on the right-hand side here, we see a large pantry cupboard. We see a sink here on the right with a cabinet where the doors can be opened or closed to hide the knee space underneath. Here we see a beautiful modern kitchen where we have a raised stove. We have a sink and a cooktop with knee space, again, adjustable height so that standing users can adjust it when they need it to be higher, and shorter people or seated users could be using it as well. We're also seeing a big adaptation in the idea of using drawers. So instead of having a dishwasher, a full height dishwasher that gets quite low, which is harder for a lot of people with bad backs, as well as for people in seated positions or shorter people, a drawer might work better. Here on the right, we see a microwave with a drawer. This particular design is one of the earlier designs. We see the controls are fairly angled up so that you can see them in a standing position, but of course shorter people or people in a seated position can just as easily reach the contents of this microwave. So here we see again kitchen accommodations. On the left we see a cabinet where we have the mixer actually on a stand that's built into the cabinet that can be easily, with a light touch, brought up to counter height, plugged in, ready to go, and then can be pushed back down when you're finished using them. I use the picture again of the sink with the knee space underneath it here in the center to highlight the color contrast that helps people with vision loss see the difference between the counter, which is a darker surface, and the lightness of the cabinets. And on the right, we see the idea of having pull-out drawers, which would be part of the food prep area or near the oven so that you can pull things out or participate fully in the kitchen. In bathrooms, simple ideas like adding an electrical outlet somewhere near the toilet so that as your needs change, and if you needed more support, rather than having a person, you can preserve your dignity and self-respect by taking care of your own toileting needs by having something like this, which is a toilet lift, which just slides over top of the toilet and needs a little electricity. Here we see some beautiful grab bars. People often think, I don't want to see grab bars, but these grab bars, I think you'll agree, are much nicer than the institutional ones we're more familiar with. With over 1,000 Canadians turning 65 a week, the market is changing dramatically. And the States, which is almost 10 times bigger than Canada, is seeing about 10,000 people turn 65 a week. So you can see where the marketplace is being encouraging, particularly with baby boomers, to have real beauty in our homes. So it's not a sacrifice anymore to have a grab bar. If you're going to look at laundry, you're picking units with good color contrast that are raised higher up, so again, you don't have to bend down. This is easier for shorter people or seated people. The controls are buttons and bright and have larger text, which is easy to read. Accessible trash and recycling units can be, if you're in a multi-unit residential situation, you might have one of those really big large bins as opposed to a private bin. And if it's half buried, you can let the truck lift this out of up and into the truck, bringing the height of the lid down to a user's height from a seated position, as we see this woman here. But it also means kids can take out the garbage, or shorter people like me can take out the garbage easily. Gardening is a big part of our lives. If we've been used to having gardening, or now we're starting to think about food security and people having gardening, the way you design your gardens in terms of the path that you provide out to it and the surface of that path and the maneuvering space through that path and the height of the actual gardening area to provide need space and be able to reach, to touch, to smell, if you're in a seated position or even for kids, can engage people far more frequently with their gardening. And then last but not least on our agenda, we wanted to cover some success stories. So where has this been in practice already? Well, in British Columbia, since 2013, the Saanich Council has passed an amendment requiring mandatory adaptable housing requirements and then some additional voluntary ones. So as the marketplace, as a lot of people were going out to British Columbia to retire out there, there are lots of opportunities. And you can see here that they have basic things like access through the front door, the lever hardware we talked about, and the transfer space in the toilets. Here we see in Ottawa, the Klaus Clementine project, which is a LEED Platinum home, so very green accessible with 42 accessible apartment buildings. And you can see on the article on the right-hand side, just above the picture of the man in the wheelchair with his dog, that the green features mean that it only costs $27 a year to heat these units, which is a great benefit to everybody. Bridgewater in Manitoba has got a Bridgewater development area. 50% of the houses had to be visitable and adaptable. And guess what? They were so beautiful, they sold out first. Here we see again the Daniels Corporation. You can see the picture on the left of the units and how beautiful they look. Anybody would be happy to live in a unit like this, and it doesn't scream that it's an accessible unit or something that's unattractive. And you can see the tower on the right. Liberty Hamlets is another project. We can see the article here from Global News on the right about being the first fully accessible condominium built in Pickering. It has 336 units. So they're going to 100%, not the minimum 15. And this project, which was built in 2001 in St. Louis, Missouri, is called 6 North Apartments. And again, I think you'll agree that the design here is beautiful. We see the color contrast, we see the door lever hardware, we see the pneumatic lift on the kitchen counter to make it adjustable for height. We see the raised kitchen appliances like the oven and the dishwasher. And the sink, again, has one of those hidden knee spaces underneath it. So lots of great ideas here and encouraging. So why should we be changing our housing design? Well, I think we have covered here 8 great reasons. 1, our statistics. 2, demographics. 3, our international agreements, federal and provincial laws. 4, it's safer to do. Falls are the leading cause of injury related to visits to emergency rooms in the US, and the primary cause of accidental deaths at 75% for people 65 and older. That's compelling by itself. Number 5, the house is easier to use by all family members and visitors. Number 6, it increases ability to live independently for longer, something I think we all want. And 7, provides flexibility to adapt to changing needs of family members as necessary, making future renovations much less expensive. So future-proofing our designs. And then of course, 8, market advantage. So few people are doing it. Anybody who's getting involved with this now has a huge lead on the industry and something to sell. Differentiate yourself in the marketplace. So last but not least, I think we should be considering who are we designing for. Here we see a graphic of a woman's entire lifetime, from an infant on the left as crawling to a toddler, to a small child with a broken arm, to a teenager with a broken leg, to being pregnant, to pushing a stroller with a child in it, to being an older person using a cane or a walker, or perhaps using a wheelchair at any time. And of course, 70% of disabilities are invisible. So any one of these people, like me, could have hearing loss or any of the other types of disabilities we talked about earlier. So really, isn't it a rookie mistake to design for the non-disabled only? Hasn't that been a really bad planning on our part? Thank you so much for attending this webinar. I hope you learned a lot today. Please feel free to reach out to me through social media, particularly on LinkedIn. My email address is thea.curdy@designable.ca. And again, our website is designable.ca. Thank you very much.